of INMS 2025. I hope all of you have had lunch, you're well fed, and you're sufficiently dry and intellectually very, very alert. So we have a stellar plenary speaker to start off our conference, Professor Alex Easton. I'll quickly introduce Alex, who's a very dear friend of our center and also obviously a great collaborator with IIT Madras. So Professor Alex Easton is professor in the Department of Psychology in Durham University, also the director of the IAS Durham, which is a very illustrious body which attracts some of the best researchers globally, and Alex happens to be the director over there. It's a wonderful place. All of you should visit it if you get a chance. Alex has published extensively on memory. He's the reason why we have such a strong neuroscience component in our center, which is also why we attracted so many abstracts from psychology this year, which is absolutely fascinating. I think we've got maximum abstracts in psychology in 2025, and I think we can thank or blame Alex for it, for that wonderful dimension. So his research interests include animal models of episodic memory, cognitive neuroscience of learning and memory, and the ways in which social contexts modulate learning and memory, which is why we come in as collaborators. We just submitted a paper together looking at memory from different perspectives of neuroscience as well as some memory studies, and that interface of the social and the scientific is exactly what we're interested at. He's got many esteemed indicators. I won't bore you with the entire details, just suffice it to say that he's a president-elect of the European Brain and Behavior Society. He's also the roving panel member of UKRI Cross-Council Interdisciplinary Research Corps. And the title of his plenary today is really brilliant and quite provocative, I think, Episodic Memory, an attempt to understand the cognitive processes and complexity of the experience. So I think we're actually in for a treat. So without any further ado, I invite Alex to give his plenary. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Avishek, and I will try and live up to expectations. I'm going to stand here very awkwardly as a neuroscientist and spend most of the talk, I think, criticizing neuroscience. I don't want you to think that that means I think everyone else in this room is right. I think I want us to think a little bit differently and understand why we might need to take a very interdisciplinary perspective in order to genuinely understand what's going on in memory. I can't do it from over here. Okay. Right. So, very, very simply at the start, I just want to introduce a few basic concepts of neuroscience that I think are critical and poorly understood, because this is the sort of fundamental neuroscience 101 lesson, which I think underpins everything that we need to do at an interdisciplinary level to try and bring different ideas together, because we have to understand the building blocks those ideas are built from. And the main first principle is there is no such thing in the brain as what used to be called a grandmother cell. These days, for various reasons, it's called a Jennifer Aniston cell. The idea of that is that in the 1960s, the perspective was maybe you had a representation of your grandmother, and it sat in one brain cell. And that brain cell was the representation of your grandmother. And it very quickly became apparent that that just doesn't work, because actually you have multiple memories of your grandmother with multiple visions of her from different perspectives and as young and old. So you can't have enough brain cells to deal with every possible representation of every possible thing. So we don't have a direct one-to-one mapping between what a brain cell does and what we do in our heads. That's number one. What we have instead are distributed representations. So we might have a representation of our grandmother, but it's now going to be spread across multiple cells in the brain, maybe across multiple systems in the brain, maybe across multiple brain areas. But actually what that allows is that that representation of my grandmother can change. It can represent her from one perspective or another, from young or old or whatever it might be. But somewhere in this network of cells, there is a representation of my grandmother as a concept rather than as a particular mental image. How we might do that is an ongoing question. There has been a great revival in recent years of the idea in neuroscience of engrams, this idea that there are specific fixed pathways in the brain which are the fundamental basis for the memory. And this comes from very excellent work looking at the manipulation of individual cells in memory. But I would really encourage you to be a little bit cautious about that work. That work really only looks at one very particular type of memory. Yep, I will. So it only looks at one very particular type of memory, and it may not be representative of all types of memory. Instead, I'm going to argue for a very constructivist theory of memory, that memories are traces in the brain which are combined with knowledge or schemas in order to reconstruct the memory that we have. So let me argue just briefly for those that don't know the background to the idea of reconstruction in memory within psychology and neuroscience. And it dates back to Sir Frederick Bartlett in in Cambridge in the 1920s. And what he was interested in was not correct memory, but errors. And that's sort of what I was saying this morning. There's an awful lot we can learn from the failure of memory. And what Frederick Bartlett did was he told 1920s Cambridge undergraduate students, who you probably can appreciate were a very particular type of middle-class white British student, and he told them stories from different cultures around the world written in ways that they were not familiar with. And the very famous one is The War of the Ghosts, which is a story from Native America, which describes a very surreal situation, a war, a battle, and it's very difficult from a Western perspective to understand what that story is about, what the characters are, what the narrative is. It's very difficult to extract that if you're a 1920s Cambridge student. But what Frederick Bartlett realized was that actually, if you got those stories and then told the students to tell that story to someone else and then tell that story again and tell that story again, that by the end of these repetition chains, the stories looked very like one another. And that's because the British students were making the same errors, and they were making the stories fit their understanding of the world. So the story doesn't start with an understanding that they have, but it ends up, they reinterpret it around knowledge structures, which Fred Bartlett called schema, in order to allow us to have the memory that we could share. And more recently, particularly in the 70s and 80s, Elizabeth Loftus's work in America on false memories has really built on this idea and the fact that we can have falsifiable memories that we firmly believe are true, but can absolutely prove are incorrect. So it all argues the idea that memory is not photographic. Memory is not the permanent storage of a thing. It is the reconstruction of something from knowledge. So I briefly changed some of the slides based on the director's introduction today. He outlined a very difficult problem for computer science, which is how you make something that looks like the brain when it takes increasing amounts of storage to store large amounts of material. And the answer is you don't. That's not, if you believe a constructivist point of view, that's not what the brain does. Instead, the brain reconstructs information. So I could have a friend, James, who I've seen give a talk at every conference from 2018 to 2023. And I could, therefore, have 6 representations in my brain, one for each of those talks. But very quickly, it becomes obvious that's not the most economical way to do it. If you take the Frederick Bartlett view of the world, actually all you need are 3 representations. James gives a talk every year. James has short hair, but in 2020, James had long hair. And from those 3 representations, I can build all 6 of those memories. But actually you can generalize far more than that. So I could even remove the in 2020 James had long hair, and I could just say it was the year of COVID, no one cut their hair, everyone had long hair, I just have this general representation. And therefore I can generalize that knowledge not just to James but to everyone. And maybe it would be more unusual if James didn't do that, and I can store those representations. So the point is that using this constructed point of view of memory, you can get very detailed memories from very little information, but you are going to be prone to error. Sometimes you will get it wrong, but that's a price you pay for efficiency. So let me deal with the type of memory that I'm most interested in, episodic memory. So episodic memory is the distinct memory for personally experienced events in your life. So if I remember what I had for breakfast this morning, that is an episodic memory. It's something that I experienced and I can recall. It's from my own personal history. For most of us, episodic memory comes with a particular form of mental imagery. So when I remember what I had for breakfast, that plate of food doesn't float in the air, isolated from anything else. I remember where I was sat, who I was sat with, what happened before it, what happened afterwards, the sounds, the smells. I build a sort of mental image of that scene. And we can sometimes, therefore, think of episodic memory almost like mental snapshots, because we all understand cameras, and it's almost like I've got a camera representation of that memory, and in my head I restore that photographic representation, and that's the job done. But it isn't really like that. It's much, much more complicated. Just think about that memory of a breakfast. I can bound it. That means I can put that event together in all sorts of different ways. Maybe I'm going to tell you about the experience of sitting down at the table and eating that plate of food. But breakfast as a concept might also mean everything from coming out my bedroom in the hotel to coming back into the bedroom in the hotel and everything that happened in between. The point is that it's not a single snapshot. I can zoom in and zoom out of that experience. I can bound it in different ways and create different experiences of different lengths and so on. I often say, if you think about memories that happen to you in everyday life, on the day that you have the memory, you can think, if you have a conversation walking down a corridor with someone, on the day you have the memory, you can think about what you said at the start of the corridor and what you said at the end of the corridor. Tomorrow you might remember the conversation you had in the corridor, and next year you might remember the conversation you had at work. The point is they're all the same event, so it's not just that I've created a snapshot and put that in my head and recalled it. It's much more complex. So the question for me is, what does this experience look like in the brain? What does the brain have to do to give us something that feels and looks like episodic memory? And we know episodic memory is different from other types of memory because we can look at amnesic patients. Amnesic patients don't have a loss of memory. They're very good at some memory tasks. They have a loss of episodic memory. They can remember their name. That's semantic memory. They can have a conversation with you. That requires working memory. What they lose and what is defined as episodic memory is the loss of episodic memory. So, episodic memory is special. But from the point of view of the brain, what does it look like? Well, we've already said there's no grandmother cell, so there's no cell in my brain that represents this moment in time. This is a photograph of a holiday I went on. It means nothing to you, but it means everything to me. This was a holiday I went on with my wife, just as things started to open up in the UK after COVID. So it's a very important memory for me, but it means nothing to you. And that's what we're trying to understand, is how do I represent that thing from this photograph that you don't? And there's not a cell in my brain that represents this memory. Instead, the representation is complex, it's distributed, and there may be specific regions of the brain that are involved in that. I know if I remove the hippocampus from the brain that I get an amnesic patient. So there are regions of the brain that are important, but I don't know what they're doing, because there is a fundamental problem, which I think really is at the heart of some of the divides between neuroscience and other disciplines. Everything that happens in the brain is the result of synapses. And synapses are simply where algorithms happen. They are where a series of inputs get combined to produce an output. And they're very straightforward. They are not entirely, but they're sort of binary. So it's essentially a computer system. You have a series of on-off inputs that come in, and through the right combinations, you get a signal that comes out. That's what happens at a cell. There's no synapse, there's no binary process in an algorithm that will generate the whole experience you have as an episodic memory. And I think sometimes when we think about episodic memories and we introspect on our own experience, the temptation is to think that's what the brain does. But the brain doesn't do that. So we need to think instead of a more mechanistic approach. How can I break down what memory or episodic memory is in a way that allows me to understand it in a way that a synapse could actually deal with? So I'm going to present to you the idea of an episodic memory simply as the combination of three things: what, where, and when. If I want to remember what I had for breakfast, I remember what I ate, I remember that I was in the hotel, and I remember it was this morning. If I remember this holiday, I remember it was a holiday, it was in Yorkshire, it was in 2020. So the episodic memories are essentially created from three pieces of information. What neuroscience spends a lot of time doing is trying to give each one of those pieces of information a specific region of the brain in which it can occur. So the what information is coming through sensory input, so it's dealt with in sensory cortex in the brain. The where information happens in the hippocampus, because that's interested in spatial navigation. When did it happen? That's a bit more complicated, maybe entorhinal cortex. And all of this is combined together in the hippocampus, because if I take the hippocampus out, you are amnesic. So that's the sort of general model of what's going on. Now, the reason that's important is because I don't want only to ask this question in humans. Because humans aren't the only things that have episodic memory. Endel Tulving argued they were. Tom Suddendorf argues that they are. But they're not, because brain evolution doesn't happen like that. Brain evolution doesn't create overnight for one species a whole module that's specialized in one function that never existed before. If we have a module in our brain that's specialized for episodic memory, and I say if, then that is a module that has developed over many, many years, and many, many species will therefore share it with us. And yet the argument that Tulving, Suddendorf and others have argued is not just that other species don't represent this memory, but even young children. The idea is that children below the age of 4 or 5, it's called developmental amnesia, don't have episodic memories from their life. Well, they certainly have all the brain structures we do. Their argument is they're not as developed. But there comes a point when you have to say, actually, what can we see in other species? By taking a mechanistic approach, might we see something that satisfies those criteria, even if I can't look inside their head and say, are they having the same experience that I'm having? This is the best figure from a paper ever produced. This was a question asked by Nikki Clayton when she was at UC Davis in the late 1990s. She's now at Cambridge. And what Nikki did was she took a group of birds, a group of corvids, scrub jays. They were endemic in California. They're a very clever type of bird, and they store food. And what she showed was that they could retrieve food in a way that suggested they had an episodic memory. Because when they retrieved food, they could remember what type of food they'd stored, whether they'd stored mealworms or peanuts, and where they'd stored it. So mealworms were over there, peanuts were over here. but also when they had stored it. Because if they'd stored it recently, they'd collect mealworms, which they really liked. But if they stored it a long time ago, they'd collect peanuts because the mealworms have gone off. And therefore, to be able to retrieve the food correctly, they have to remember what they stored, where they stored it, and how long ago they stored it. And that fits this criteria of what, where, when memory. And Nikki argued that this was evidence of episodic memory, not just in mammals, but in birds. This is an ancient shared evolutionary phenomenon. But there was a problem. For the next 10 years, no one could reproduce it in any other animal. And I think the argument for that is something that we all probably, from our own experience, think is critical. And that is that I very simply don't think time is important. It's very hard as humans to think of an episodic memory that doesn't involve time. But actually, what is time? Because sometimes it will be, it happened this morning. Sometimes it will be, it happened last week. Sometimes it will be the first thing that happened or the second thing. Sometimes it will be, well, it must have been 2023 because that was the last time I was in Chennai. These are all very different concepts of time. And actually, what we've argued is that all time is doing in an episodic memory is saying these two events are different because I can separate them from one another. And time is one way you can separate them from one another, but actually there are lots of ways I can separate things from one another. I've given a talk in this building before. It was in the room across the courtyard. So I can separate those memories by which room I gave that talk in. I don't need to remember what order they came in or which years I gave them in, but I still know that those two talks were different and they can therefore exist as different memories in my head, even though the time is not a critical feature. So when you do that, and you say, well, actually, let's explore what happened where and on which occasion, and you can define which occasion in different ways. Here, for rats on the left and for humans on the right, it's through the creation of different walls and environments, different contexts that the animals or the humans sit in. When you do that, you can show Nikki Clayton's what, where, which occasion behavior across all sorts of animals. So I showed you those species for a reason. I've done this in mice, in rats, in marmosets, and in macaques. You can show it. But also, you can show it in young children. So this idea that episodic memory doesn't exist before the age of 4 or 5, this behavior works at the age of 18 months. So the content of the memory is achievable in ways that we might not think it was achievable if we had this sort of more simple view of episodic memory. Right, I'm going to speed up a bit now because I just want to deal with some concepts. So this all relates to the idea that there are memory systems in the brain, that there is a system in the brain that deals with episodic memory, and there simply might not be. This was a paper written by my PhD supervisor who sadly died this year. David was a great man for writing amazing papers, and I would encourage everyone to read them, but be aware that he never made them anything that you would want to read. They were the most complex thing you will ever read, but the ideas in them were amazing. And this 25 years ago is someone saying, maybe there is no memory system in the brain, that maybe every single synapse in the brain is learning. So why do we need a specific system in the brain to store memories? Because every synapse is storing a memory. Maybe it's back to this complex distributed idea that we don't need a system, we just need to bring all this information together. I'm now regretting putting animations in, but anyway. There is a way to test this idea. Amnesic patients can't remember events. So it's easy to say, therefore, the thing that amnesic patients lose is where event memories are stored. But there's a problem with that Richard Gregory pointed out in the 1960s, which is that if I take a component out of a television and the picture goes wavy, the purpose of that component was not to stop the picture going wavy. That is the consequence of removing it. The consequence of removing the hippocampus is that you don't have episodic memories. That's not the same as it being the function of the hippocampus. So based on David's idea, this was work by Ellen Maguire in London, who we also sadly lost recently. And she used an effect called boundary extension, which is wonderful. If you've never heard of boundary extension, it's just bizarre. So you take pictures like these, which are objects against a very regular background, and you'll see the object sort of fills the background. And you give these to people for a number of seconds, and then you take them away, and then you say, please, can you draw a picture of what you've just seen? And this is what people like you and me, this is what we draw. And you'll notice something very weird. They're not accurate, but they are consistent. Everyone has zoomed out of the picture. The bananas now take up much less space on the picture than they did in real life. The bucket does the same. And it doesn't matter whether you're asked to draw them or whether you're asked to recognize these pictures. You think you saw something that was much more zoomed out. You have essentially in your brain extended the boundary of the picture that you saw. Your brain has extended the picture beyond the boundary, and you believe that's what you saw. Now here's the interesting bit. And that's all that ChatGPT does. It looks at the most statistical likely outcome. And Sen would argue that's exactly what the brain does. But it's looking for statistically what is the most likely outcome from the little bits of information that I have. Let me build a scenario around that information. And sometimes it will be right, sometimes it will be wrong. It's evolved, so it's going to be right more than it's wrong. But that's the idea, is that this is an efficient, but actually, in terms of data stored, a fairly minimalist system. Which is sort of what David Gaffin argued 25 years ago. That memory is this distributed thing. You don't need a single system dealing with episodic memory. You just have stuff that's being learnt in the brain. And somewhere, all of that stuff gets put together to create a scenario, to create an event, to create an episodic memory. So very quickly, just to end, I'll talk about a few things that we've done with our, in Durham, we have a big interdisciplinary project looking at the same sort of questions. So here's a paper that we published recently, which says, well, okay, what this is sort of saying is we can separate the experience of episodic memory from the content of episodic memory. But why? What's the purpose in that? And the argument we give there is actually, we know, we neuroscientists tend to ignore it, but we know that cognition involves embodiment, inaction, extended cognition, and embedded cognition. All of these 4E cognition is prominent, and we do it. But actually, it's very hard to explain how we do it in memory. Because when you remember something, what's your ability to embody it? Well, our argument is that that's what the experience is. If you want to think, what did I have for dinner last night? If I can create a scenario, if I can build a model of my environment and what was on the table and all of this, then I can use my 4E cognition to do all the predictive stuff that helps me remember the information. So there is a feedback. I get the content of the information, I build a scenario, and that scenario feeds back and allows me to build the memory itself using 4E cognition. So the content of the memory and the experience are serving different purposes. But also we know that there is a mirror between remembering the past and imagining the future, and the same thing can be true. If I want to know what to cook for dinner when I'm at work, I can't go and open my fridge and use 4E cognition to work out what to do, but I can in my head. I can use my memory to construct the scenario in my head of what my fridge is like, and then imagine through 4E cognition the sort of embodiment processes and so on that will allow me to think, what will I make? So you have a reason for separating cognition, the experience of cognition, from the process of cognition. It also allows us to think a bit differently about the content of the memory. Because when we saw this model earlier, we said we've got information about what happened, information about where it happened, information about which occasion it happened on. But actually, we just have information. Maybe we don't need to separate it so much. Context has always been a very big problem for neuroscience and computational neuroscience, because we all know it's involved. We all can find context in our episodic memories, but no one can define what a context is. But I assume everyone in this room knows that actually, when you read a sentence, the context is often derived by the time you get to the end of the sentence, not while you're reading. And neuroscience never considers this. It's as if the context has to be encoded. Well, it doesn't have to be encoded. If you take this very different approach to this model, what you can say is there are sensory and emotional inputs. You build an environment, you build a scene, and from that you extract information about in what, where, and which occasion. And that later on might feed back into the model to construct a different scene that you use for your memory or to imagine the future. It's a very different way of looking at the same process, and it means we don't need to find, again, an episodic memory system or a system in the brain that only deals with time or context or anything like that. Okay, so the final point I want to make is I spent a long time in this talk criticizing neuroscience. Rightly, I think. I think neuroscience has got itself into a bit of a hole. It's become technologically advanced and it's become philosophically poor. It doesn't necessarily understand the models that it uses. I think that needs to change. But that doesn't mean everyone else is right. Doesn't mean everyone else is doing better. It might sound like what I've just said to you is, gosh, memory's complex, isn't it? But I think it's more nuanced than that. And this is the paper that Avishek and I submitted yesterday. In a way, I'd like to use the metaphor of driving. Memory is like driving a car. But neuroscientists have become the mechanics. Neuroscientists are obsessed that the pistons behave differently from the wheels and the brakes are independent of the accelerator, which is all true. But understanding how the pistons work does not map one-on-one with the experience of driving. However, I would argue that other areas of memory studies make the opposite problem. That they might understand the sociality, who else is in the car with me? They might understand the environmental aspects, what is the air conditioning doing? And all of these will feed into the driving experience. But equally, if the pistons stop turning, you can't drive even if the air conditioning's on. And the interaction of the mechanics of the car with the environment are critical to that experience. That's what makes the experience different every time. And I think that's where we all need to actually find a common ground, not to just say, let's make it complex, so let's deal with the complexities, or let's understand the process, so let's deal with the mechanics, but to actually say, let's bring this together and understand how these systems interact in ways that maybe I've started to point to how we might think of that. So we can still each take our own approach, whether that's empirical or not, but we can actually get something from it that allows us to understand memory in a more useful everyday sense. So with that, I come to the end. Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone who's been on the journey with me. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Alex. I think you'll agree that is probably the perfect point to start in terms of the philosophical convergence we are hoping to achieve in this conference, looking at neuroscience and memory studies, not as disciplinary opposites, but actually a convergence that should have been tapped much earlier, and I'm happy we're doing it now. And this conference, I think, is a step in the right direction. And as you can see, what Alex did with great skill and with great, I think it's something for us to learn in memory studies, to translate this research to a non-scientific audience. And that requires something that I think all of us can take away from that. So just for that, can we have a round of applause for Alex, just for this massive translation? I think that for me is the biggest takeaway. How can we make the disciplines talk to each other, but also help them listen better to each other? And I think the paper that he mentioned at the end, using a metaphor of driving, that's something which was very attractive to me personally, because again, if you're looking at the whole sort of ontology versus experience debate, it doesn't have to be a versus thing. The ontology can be an experience, and experience can be the ontological thing, and the two can be connected. But also going back to someone like Frederick Bartlett, talking about schema, talking about the cultural slippages of memory. And that allows us, I think, in memory studies to look at it from that sort of macro-micro positionality, whereas, again, they don't have to be ontological opposites. They can go together, where we can look at the slippages both as neural synaptic phenomena, but also as cultural phenomena. And again, we're looking at the synaptic condition, the neural condition, the encodedness of memory as something which is always already embedded within the cultural matrix. So again, that becomes a fascinating dialogue. It also allowed me to connect to something like what Astrid Earle would call implicit collective memory. The idea that we have this idea of a collective memory, which is always already there. So no matter what new data you give to it, it'll always read it in that particular way because it is always already biased. So I think there's a really interesting and rich connection that we can really get into. And if nothing else works, this paper that he and I are working will help us drive better, I think. So because we're using a metaphor of driving. So with that, I thank Alex for what has been a brilliant start to this conference. This is exactly the spirit and the philosophical point we were hoping to sort of start with, because as I remember, as I mentioned in the morning, and as what Professor Kamakati was also saying, this triangulation between cultural studies, neuroscience, digitality, I think we live in a time where more than ever, we need to calibrate and study this entanglement, because we need to stop looking at AI as an enemy. We need to stop looking at neuroscience as something which happens in complex labs. We need to translate that into what is happening here now, and that here nowness of memory is something that we can only achieve if we stop suspecting other disciplines of doing things which are esoteric or complex or uninteresting. I think everything is interesting. I think any one thing that can be said about memory studies, which is also a problem, is that almost anything can be about memory studies. And of course, it makes a lot of sense to start a conference like this with a really celebrated neuroscientist like Alex, who's, again, you can imagine, is one of the biggest figures in his field, but also this effort and engagement with other fields is exactly what gives us hope as a discipline of memory studies, that we can collaborate and co-create in the times to come. So thank you again very much, Alex, and we really appreciate and we sort of acknowledge your contributions to our conference, but also look forward to seeing this conference as something which may grow bigger in the times to come, and institutional collaborations, more symbiotic, synaptic relationships, if I may say, with other disciplines is something we can definitely look forward to. So thank you very much. Can you have a round of applause, please? So you're very welcome to interact with Alex informally after this, but we'll have to move on quickly to the other panels. So we'll start with the next panel right away, and also the virtual halls with kick in right after this. So thank you very much for your attendance, and I hope to see you around for the rest of the conference as well. Thank you.